So, welcome to Marx 413. We have Karl Marx and his 1844 Paris manuscripts, the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts. We have Jacques Lacan and his 1958 seminar, The Dream of the Butcher's Beautiful Wife, Informations of the Unconscious. And we have Renata Salecl, in print and in person. A brilliant critical theorist, philosopher, sociologist, who approaches her objects from a psychoanalytic perspective. I couldn't be more thrilled to have Renata with us. It's a true privilege, particularly for this session. So Renata Salecl joins us from Ljubljana, Slovenia, where she is a senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law, and also a professor at the School of Law at Birkbeck College in London. We've had the pleasure of hosting Renata at previous 1313s. We also had the pleasure of doing a seminar together, a week-long seminar together at the Center for Contemporary Critical Thought before COVID. I think it was on algorithms and the Expository Society. It was absolutely fabulous. Renata Salecl is the author of numerous books, including A Passion for Ignorance, the most recent book, What We Choose Not to Know and Why, The Tyranny of Choice, 2011, On Anxiety, 2004, Perversions of Love and Hate, with Verso. Before that, The Spoils of Freedom, Psychoanalysis and Feminism After the Fall of Socialism, and a lot more work. Renata Salecl's work is extremely interdisciplinary, focuses on bringing together law, criminology, the study of political ideologies, psychoanalysis, questions of human rights. Right now, Renata Salecl is doing a lot of work on outer space and rights to the outer space, and as well as work in the bioethics area and questions of triage. So today, Renata Salecl joins us to pair Marx with Lacan, and suggested that we read in connection with Marx's Paris manuscripts, Lacan's seminar from the Formations of the Unconscious. So let me just say a few words to set this up before passing it to Renata Salecl. On the blog, you have a lengthy introduction that sets out the works that we'll be reading tonight and explains them, puts them in their historical context, and puts them in relationship with each other. There's also a very provocative and brilliant essay by Renata Salecl called Catastrophe, Apathy, and Sublimation, how people in the US are dreaming about the end of the world, and we'll be talking about that this evening. And there's also a short interview we did last night, a video of a conversation with Renata Salecl to kind of place some of the Lacanian ideas in context and to help understand where Lacan's seminar is coming from. So a good contextualization of the seminar itself, all of which is really helpful for this evening's seminar. Last session, we explored with Jean Cohen the articles that Marx published in 1844, so the same year as the manuscripts, in the German-French annals. So we studied the introduction to a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right and on the Jewish question. And it's after those articles that Marx settles in for several months to study the leading texts in political economy from about April to August of 1844. He's reproducing passages, annotating them, commenting on them, and then writing about them in those manuscripts. Now that work in the manuscripts really grows out of the earlier articles. There's a kind of a direct line, and you can find the seeds of the Paris manuscripts in those two articles from 1844. In the introduction to his critique of Hegel, which he publishes that year in February, right? Marx argues that the fundamental task of philosophy, in his words, is to unmask human self-alienation in its secular forms. Okay? Now, what did he mean by that? How? Well, clearly this had followed his admiration and his reversal of Feuerbach. Marx was proposing to perform on the human realm in society the work that Feuerbach had achieved with religion, namely to expose the struggles within society, these times the alienations, of course. As you recall, Feuerbach was talking about human alienation vis-a-vis religion and God, and the way in which we project ourselves, alienate ourselves, and project ourselves onto God. Marx now is going to flip that and look at the alienation within society. And as he writes, the critique of the heavens is transformed into the critique of the earth. Now, what he finds when he performs that reversal is human alienation of a different kind. He already wrote on the Jewish question that he already wrote, quote, "What prevails in the so-called Christian state is not man, but alienation." So he was on this path, and it's really what he finds when he gets there in the texts and in the experience of the workers. The task then is to explore human alienation. As you know, in the Paris manuscripts, he associates those with the workers' alienation from their work product, from their labor, from their human essence, species being, and from other people. And so he declines this. There's a declination of this in multiple formulas, right? The work product becomes exterior object. The worker becomes a slave to that object. The worker is deformed as they form the object. The worker is disempowered, reduced to an animal status. And he elaborates on these ideas with these remarkable expressions, right? The more the worker produces, the less he can consume, he writes. The more values he creates, the more valueless, the more unworthy he becomes. The better formed his product, the more deformed he becomes. They become, the worker. The more civilized the object, the more barbarous the worker, etc., etc. And it's on these premises that he then kind of does a declination of its consequences and its political consequences. It's on those premises of alienation that, for instance, he starts to develop the kind of sketch, the seed of his theory of history, since it's by overcoming self-alienation that history is propelled, and he considers communism to be the dialectical overcoming through the abolition of private property of that central conflict in society, what he calls the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. And it's, of course, here that he famously writes, communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. Okay, so basically the alienation is what anchors his incipient theory of history. It's also what forms the basis of his critique of philosophy, specifically Hegel's philosophy, more specifically Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. He accuses Hegel of basically having posited self-consciousness as the essence of human beings and misconstrued this so that it's self-consciousness that becomes estranged rather than the worker. And of course, the critique of Hegel emanates from this same nucleus of issues. Estrangement was misdiagnosed by Hegel and has to be set straight by locating the true essence in the human. So everything turns on the theory of alienation, which has been extremely productive in critical theory. We've had numerous developments of that and attempts to understand it in our contemporary context as well. You can think of Rahel Yegi's book, Alienation, in which she reconceives alienation through a kind of a contemporary lens to look at feelings of helplessness in contemporary society. You can think of Hartmut Rosa's book, Alienation, Acceleration, where he looks at it through acceleration of time and the way in which the acceleration of time is making people feel alienated from self and others. So there have been many developments, and in part what we're going to do tonight is kind of further those developments on alienation in our return to Marx through a return to Freud and Lacan, in order to actualize the theory, in order to think about it in its contemporary resonance, particularly in our condition today, post-COVID, post-election in the United States, and with all of the circumstances that characterize this moment. It's here that Renata Salecl is absolutely indispensable and is going to be our guide. And we'll explore Lacan's work to help us understand the logic of desire and anxiety and sublimation and catastrophe in contemporary contexts. So with that, let me turn it to Renata Salecl. Welcome, Renata, and welcome you all to Marx 413. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard, for the invitation and for setting up this discussion. Now, what Marx does in this text is he brings back into discussion the subject. In his critique of political economy of his time, he points out, that the subject, the laborer, is alienated. However, when he speaks about alienation, when he speaks about the products of the proletarian's work, being kind of objectified in the commodity, he in some way constantly comes back to the issue of the subject, to the issue of the laborer. He speaks in the text about the misery of the laborer. He even lists different types of misery that the laborer experiences in capitalism, even in society which is going economically well. Marx points out, the subject is in some way or in a position of the object that has to kind of satisfy the demands coming from the other being the capitalist, who is interested in kind of extracting the surplus value from the laborer. So subject is in a way deprived of his or her subjective position. Now, when we read Lacan together with Marx, we need to understand that psychoanalysis actually developed at the time when capitalism was sort of fully developed. And it was sort of capitalism which in an important way has been shaping people's desires, and also capitalism has in some way sustained itself by exploiting people's desires, especially their desire for unsatisfied desire, which is why we are reading Marx together with the short text by Jacques Lacan, in which he analyzes a dream of the butcher's wife. The beautiful butcher's wife was the dream that was presented first to Freud. This butcher's wife was in analysis with Freud, and one day she explained that she had a dream where she was trying to create a party, like a dinner party, but she looked into her fridge and only had a little tiny slice of salmon. She started thinking in the dream that maybe she will go shopping, and then she remembers it is Sunday, the shops are closed. Then she's thinking, maybe I will call around and, try to get some food elsewhere, and she remembers that her phone is not working. So at the end of the dream, she gives up her desire to create a dinner party. Now, in this dream, what is interesting is that we are not going to focus on the meaning of the dream, but on a certain kind of a value that comes, sort of into being only through kind of a lengthy free association that the butcher's wife has in analysis. So Freud is sort of questioning her when she explains the dream, sort of like how does she connect, this desire for the party which she cannot kind of realize. And the butcher's wife starts explaining that her husband, the butcher, whom she likes very much, likes women who have some curves. He likes to touch some meat, not only during the work, but, in the body of the woman. And she is such a, let's say, meaty woman, very much loved by her husband. And she also explains in her analysis that she adores caviar. Since her husband loves her, he wants to bring her caviar all the time, but she is prohibiting him to bring the caviar. So she likes caviar, but actually doesn't want to get it. And then, she sort of is bothered in her story that her husband is paying strange attention lately to a mutual friend who is very thin, who doesn't look at all like an ideal that the butcher has about, what is a beautiful woman. But he looks at her quite, approvingly, likes talking to her. And this friend is quite into salmon. But she also kind of, let's say, although she likes salmon, she kind of finds ways not to get salmon. And of course, if we remember the dream, here too, there is just a little piece of salmon in the dream that the butcher's wife has for a potential party. Now, throughout the dream, we learn that the butcher's wife desire was really a desire for unsatisfied desire. So Freud and Lacan, kind of explain this dream as a kind of a dream which points out that the hysteric, and Freud and Lacan both analyze the woman as a hysteric, finds a particular kind of enjoyment in keeping desire unsatisfied. However, it is not only this desire, let's say, for caviar, which she's trying not to get, or the friend also desire for salmon, which again, she's not getting, but it is also the question of the other's desire. So the butcher's wife is worried about the desire of her husband. The question for her is, what kind of an object is she in the desire of her husband? So she's keeping her desire unsatisfied because in some way, by teasing her husband, please don't bring me caviar, and teasing him also in other ways, she's trying, to kind of keep, let's say, his desire alive. She is sort of, in a way, slipping away and being present at the same time for her beloved husband. Now, this little dream opens up, numerous issues which can be helpful for understanding how psychoanalysis and, the studies that have been done by Marx can kind of complement each other's. Now, in capitalism, we see that, that capitalism in some way constantly creates profits from people's dissatisfactions. We know that as consumers, we are, always kind of, let's say, searching for an object, never finding one. Consumption very much encourages us, to do this. Of course, we are questioning what do others desire, as consumers, but also as people. And of course, we are questioning how are we desired by others. In the meaning of, how are we desired by people that we know, people around us, and so what is our status in society as such, what Lacan calls the big other. One of the kind of the easiest explanation for the term the big other is that for Lacan, the big other is sort of, let's say, institutions, written and unwritten rules, culture, everything that kind of holds, society together. It appears to be kind of a structure which we are living in, and especially a very important part of the big other is language. Now, the subject creates a fantasy of the consistency of the big other, the fantasy which sort of covers up the antagonisms that are marking the society. And, Marxist thought has been analyzing the antagonisms very well, especially the antagonism, let's say, between the proletarians and the capitalists. But Lacan, points out in a way that the fantasy that the subject creates, temporarily gives him or her the perception that there is no antagonism, or creates a certain kind of a story of some kind temporarily coherent big other, and so that the subject might at least temporarily get also some perception of, coherence of him or herself. Although, as we know very well from psychoanalytic thought, the subject is split, marked. It actually is also alienated. So in psychoanalysis, we have a slightly different perception of the term alienation. Alienation happens when we become speaking beings, when we are marked by culture, by language, when we also need to deal with the fact that we are not an ultimate object of the desire of our primary caregivers, that our primary caregivers have desires beyond us, and which means that we need to kind of go through frustration early on in our life when we, let's say, go through socialization. And of course, we'll forever deal with the dissatisfaction and of course, these questions of what do I want and what do others want? How do I appear in the eyes of the others? And what is my status in society as such? As French psychoanalyst Colette Soler pointed out in one of her essays, is that to those questions, the subject never finds a proper answer and always tries to, let's say, read in between the lines. Let's say that I am worried, who am I for my partner, no matter which words my partner will give me, will not satisfy me. I will look for the tone of his or her voice, how he or she looks at me. I will interpret the in between the lines of the words that I'm getting, let's say, to my question of who am I for you, for the other. Now, since I come from former Yugoslavia, I also experienced a certain moment of the collapse of the big other. Let's say, in our case, it happened in 1991 when the country collapsed, when Yugoslavia fell apart. At that moment, let's say the fantasies, the perceptions that people had about, the big other, the structure in which they were born, suddenly collapsed. And, it happened in a similar way also in other East European countries when they went through the transition. Quite often we observed at the time of the collapse of socialism that countries were cutting out from their flags the communist star, and this was sort of like where you can see the lack in the society as such, which of course we were quickly trying to patch up, which is why countries were searching for some old insignias that they were patching into the whole of, let's say, the flag being one of the, let's say, symbols of a kind of a big other that, as I say, temporarily might give us some element to which we, let's say, in which we try to ground our identity. So today, I would like to move a little bit further from the historical discussions about, the link between Lacanian thinking and Marxist thinking, to share with you some of my questions and thoughts about what kind of changes we might observe today, and sort of the question how we can push forward psychoanalytic thinking to try to find answers to some of the contemporary antagonisms and questions. At the end of my book, The Passion for Ignorance, I came across a very interesting research, which I'm quoting, from just before the pandemic, 2019. A group of US and Danish political scientists decided to question whether people who are sharing fake news and conspiracy theories online actually believe in what they are sharing. So at that time, we still had Twitter. They interviewed 6,000 passionate Twitter users who were, sharing conspiracy theories and fake news. To their surprise, they saw that in the interviews that majority of people did not believe in what they were sharing. So they were sharing certain fake news in which they did not believe. What their gain is, I think related precisely to what I was, setting out just a few minutes ago, this question of who am I for the other. So through sharing fake news and conspiracy theories, people got recognition. First, they got recognition from their own group, people who are, let's say, their followers, were liking and, sharing further those theories. And second recognition was that they got is the anger from the opposite group. People who did not identify with them started attacking them. And these attacks, anger, brought a paradoxical enjoyment to the sharers of the news. They were thrilled to provoke the anger. So they got two satisfactions, in our times where we feel often that we are not recognized, that, we don't have a place in the big other, that others do not observe us. We should kind of understand that this space of the social medias as a space which does bring at least temporary satisfaction to some people. Of course, we should also not forget that the algorithms privilege often such provocative messages like fake news and conspiracy theories. They make them more visible. Now, at the end of this research, there was another quite surprising element, which is that about a quarter of people interviewed, they were hoping that the society as we know it would go to hell. That there will be like a total reset of society. And, they were sort of kind of really expressing the desire, similar to the film Joker, to kind of burn the world as we know it down. Now, these people often fantasized that in the rubble of this kind of, let's say, burned down world, a small group of survivors could begin and create a new world. Now, this research was done just before the pandemic. And it appeared, that the pandemic later, with its sort of devastating deadly effects on the society was sort of like one step, in this direction of kind of burning the world down. And, then of course we had the war in Ukraine and now war in Gaza. And it is interesting to see how all those things, pandemic, the wars around the world are kind of accelerating now this idea to kind of tear the world as we know down. Last year, just before the elections in Argentina, I had a chance to spend a few weeks in Buenos Aires. And I decided to speak with people from, let's say, numerous streams of life. What do they think about Xavier Milei, who was, an outsider, but came into these elections with, really shocking, ideas, and, he's quite a shocking figure. Just before the elections, one book was published about him with the title El Loco, the Madman. And, he has 5 dogs who are named after the economists from the kind of the 70s the start of neoliberal ideologies. His sister is his, second in charge and so on. So there are a lot of very strange things about him. Now, quite a number of people then in Argentina were thinking that it is best to elect Milei because he will tear the world down as we know it. So some young entrepreneurs would tell me that they have enough of perpetual crisis of sort of 20 years of the same, where nothing sort of changes, and it is better if someone comes and, just, tears all the institutions down. That's an enormous kind of, let's say, change. Even if they did not believe in the ideology that Milei was promoting, people thought it is worth gambling on a reset of society. So they had exactly the same idea of the reset of the society. Now, just before elections in the United States, the British newspaper, The Guardian, reported on how on the online platform Telegram, various neo-Nazi groups discussed the need that something needs to happen so that people would stop living in this shithole, as they said, forever. So some people were speaking about the collapse. It is necessary that we have a collapse. It is necessary that we also accelerate this collapse. It might be necessary to start a civil war, others were saying. Now, the collapse that kind of dominated these discussions in some way was, kind of linked to various ideas of white supremacy, neo-Nazis, and so on, the need to arm oneself, and so on. But many of those people who were speaking about collapse, also were pointing out that it doesn't really matter who wins the elections, because in both cases, there might be a possibility to kind of really come closer to this idea of a reset. So one theory was that if Kamala Harris wins, more people will be dissatisfied with having woman of color, as the president, which is why more people might join the white supremacists or neo-Nazis. So their numbers might grow as a result, which would be, in their opinion, a positive thing. And, others, of course, were thinking it might not be too bad if Trump wins because, they will have a more leisurely ride during his presidency, their organizations. Now, they were also talking, those people, about, the will to self-sacrifice. Some were saying, it might be necessary that some of us die, and, we will die trying. At least we will do something, and it is because it is through collapse that we will win. Now, Marx, in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript from 1844, speaks a lot about, the goal of capitalist economic system being in some way the unhappiness of society. So he says that even in the kind of favorite conditions, there is quite often, a sort of misery for the workers, from overwork, premature death, decline, where they become, just kind of mere machines when they are simply servants of the capital, as he says, more competition emerges, more starvation for some workers, at the end beggary. So he says that, in some way, in advancing state, capitalism, brings just another type of misery. He says this is like misery with complications, or kind of a static misery where, not much changes for the proletarian. However, quite a lot changes for the capitalist who can extract, more value. Now, Marx then concludes that political economy really, in some way, advances the proposition that the proletarian is kind of the same as any horse. We must get as much as possible out of him to work. We are not considering, this person when the person is not working as a human being. And he said when the person is not working, we kind of leave it to the religion, to doctors, to politics, to deal with him, but the capital will not, be kind of interested in the worker who is not working. Now, today we have kind of an interesting next step in the perception of working. British psychoanalyst Jacques Cohen, a few years ago, published an interesting book called Not Working. Now, Josh describes how he is encountering more and more patients who are coming to analysis to him, who are fantasizing about not working. Now, these are patients who are working a lot, many hours. They're quite often quite successful people. But what they are dreaming about and what they are talking about in analysis is that they would like to live in a kind of a bliss of catatonic exhaustion, where they would do nothing the whole weekend, not even reading, maybe just read a single line in the newspaper for the whole day. And when this line will acquire kind of an element of emptiness, it will be like a Buddhist mantra. So Josh Cohen notes that people are caught today between the compulsion to do as much as possible and this desire to do nothing. And for many office workers, when they are working in the office, working hours are also a constant run between working and browsing on the internet, wondering which of the 23 different versions of the white t-shirt they should buy, or watching irrelevant movies on YouTube, or passionately consuming social media. So many people go through the day in a kind of a state of apathy, dreamliness, or even indifference. But then it looks as if these people are easily awoken when they engage in heated debates on the social media, or when they start, enjoying, kind of engaging with populist discourse with which they might not even identify with. Now, Lacanian notion of desire and another notion of Lacan, jouissance, come handy in understanding this logic. Since, as Lacan, kind of analyzing Freud's theories of dream, points out, how important for the subject is to keep, his or her desire unsatisfied. Now, although rationally people might claim that they want to have something, unconsciously they might do everything not to satisfy their desires. In addition, people might find jouissance in self-destruction or fantasies about the possible end of the world. Now, in the last years, there has been an increase of these discussions about the end of the world. There is a whole new science emerging, which is called collapsology, which is looking at how previous civilization collapsed, but also sort of like what kind of beliefs emerged at the time of collapse of societies. And many of the researchers who work in these collapsology studies, for example, point out that in the collapses of the previous civilization, quite often you had a turn, to sort of kind of a mythical thinking, or, religion became very prominent quite often in the moments of the collapses of society. Now, for me, it had been interesting to observe, how the discussions about the end of the world have been, present now for some time among some religious groups in the United States and elsewhere, especially, here among evangelical Christians. Now, Freud, in his Civilization and Discontents, argues that religion serves as some kind of a collective neurosis for humanity. It is a way to channel and mitigate the inherent tensions between individuals' desires and the demands of society. So Freud's idea was that religion might help people to sublimate, their conflicting urges. Now, Freud's notion of sublimation is often linked to works of art. Let's say that people have conflicting tensions, conflicting feelings, and, they are not acting necessarily on those feelings, but are creating something. Let me give you an example of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had very conflicting feelings in regard to his father. He was fantasizing about the death of his father. And, when his father died, he had even more, kind of feelings of guilt and so on. However, he channeled very successfully those conflicting feelings towards his father into his work. Brothers Karamazov, we have, the killing of the father, and, we have father figures, elsewhere also. So we can see that was like an example of sublimation. Science might be also, a type of sublimation. Sometimes we might be anxious about, something like the pandemic, and then, we put energy into, analyzing how to create vaccines. That may be like a form of sublimating a particular important anxiety. Now, Freud, however, perceives religion also as a type of sublimation, which sort of kind of channels, those also conflicts between individual desires and demands of society. So by sublimating some urges into religious activities, individuals often find an acceptable outlet for those impulses and also gain, at least temporarily, some psychological comfort, the feeling of belonging, and, also, as Freud says, a kind of a, let's say, comfort also in the illusion that there might be an ultimate protector in the form of God. Now, while building on Freud's theories, Lacan offered a slightly different perspective on sublimation, which, however, also extends to religion. From Lacanian point of view, religious belief and practices can be seen as attempts to fill the fundamental lack in the human existence. The lack which, as I said, comes through the process of socialization when humans become speaking beings. So religion might offer, a possibility to transcend the symbolic order of language and society. So religion in Lacan's work can provide a way for individuals to kind of engage with this unrepresentative double realm, with the lack in society and, in themselves. However, the link between religion and sublimation in some way also involves another important concept from psychoanalysis, and that is death drive. Now, Lacan has linked death drive to the idea of the creatio ex nihilo, which means that this kind of destructive nature of the death drive is not linked simply to the kind of the push towards destruction or self-destruction. Behind, the drive, the death drive, which might push us to the self-destruction, is, a kind of a desire for a renewal. So death drive and, the drive, which is a drive for destruction, in some way is linked also with sort of like a start from, let's say ground zero, a kind of a renewal, a certain kind of a life drive. So Lacan points out that death drive, in some way, also one can observe also in the domain of the social. So we have a certain kind of a destruction linked also to the perception of the social symbolic space, but there is too a will for a new start, a start from the point of nothing. So we can see that sublimation in some way offers a creative way for the subject to relate to the fundamental lack or the void, which characterizes the human desire. And in some way, sublimation transforms the death drive potential, this kind of destructive drive, which sort of pushes the subject, maybe to the point of self-annihilation, to the point of, sort of kind of trying to find a renewal, a reset. Now, there have been a number of researchers who have looked at how different religions differently perceive sublimation in the religious setting. Researchers Dow Cohen, Emily Kim, and Nathan Hudson, for example, looked at sublimation and religion and, among different religious groups. And they concluded that Protestants, compared with Catholic and Jews, were in their research more likely to kind of minimalize troublesome effects and kind of displace them into creative works. Creative work here, however, does not necessarily mean arts. It can also mean, certain kind of social mobilizing activities, which might also be linked to particular political purposes. So they were looking at, how different groups might, with the help of sublimation, find new ways to socialize themselves or, engage in different kind of creative pursuits. Now, for me, it was interesting to observe how in the last years there has been a kind of an acceleration of the discussion of, the end of the world and kind of the renewal linked to the idea of the second coming of Christ among numerous evangelical churches in the United States. I very much, kind of liked two documentaries which were presenting this question. One documentary is called Praying for the Armageddon. It was done in 2023. The director is Norwegian filmmaker Tonje Hansen Schei and American filmmaker Michael Rowley. And they look at the fundamentalist religious churches in the United States and their link with the political sphere. In the film, they interview many senators and members of the Congress who are openly saying that they are supporting these churches and they are openly speaking about the second coming of Christ. In the movie, one number we learn is that there might be about 100 US Congress people who have declared themselves as members of these churches. The other film, which is also very interesting to watch, is a documentary made by Israeli filmmaker Maya Zinstein called Till Kingdom Come. In this film, we can learn about the support of some of the evangelical churches for the settlers in the West Bank, since some are believing that, the second coming of Christ, will happen when the last war might happen in the Holy Land. However, that war will happen after we will have numerous previous signs. One sign might be the pandemic. The second sign, of the second coming of Christ might be linked to the Ukrainian war. But the third, the major conflict, will happen in the Holy Land, and the war in Gaza might be in some understandings perceived as, the last sign which confirms the apocalyptic prediction that the Christ is about to return. As Tennessee pastor Jacques a year ago in one of the sermons said, actually we have signs that the last days are coming. The film also, in an interesting way, presents the organization called Christians United for Israel, which already years ago started financially supporting Jewish settlers in their occupation of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank. Since the idea has been, that the Christ return, before the Christ return, Jews should control the whole of Holy Land. However, when the Christ returns, the Jews will, in the belief of the evangelicals, need to accept Christian religion. Otherwise, they might end up in hell. Now, the complicated relationship between the beliefs in the end of the world and, the support for the particular politics of the, current regime in Israel is very well explained in both films, and especially, I would say, the financial interest in the support of the settlers is very much well documented in the film Till Kingdom Comes. Now, late professor of Islamic studies Barbara Freyer-Stowasser, a few years ago, analyzed the perception of the end of the world in different religions, in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam, and found that in each religion there was, a particular use of the end of the world debates for secular political purposes. So Stowasser points out that religions often have elements also of superiority in their messages, in which, they perceive their perceptions in some way superior to others' perceptions about the end of the world. Now, her idea, however, is that in this analysis of the end of the world, we should understand that they are speaking about vulnerability and alienation, often of people, and the collective anxieties that people have in regard to what is happening around them. However, quite often, these ideas of the end of the world might be linked to particular sort of, let's say, secular political goals. And quite often, they might perceive, one religion that they have a kind of a superior and perception of the end of the world than others have. Although, as she points out, there is quite a similarity in these perceptions. Now, in psychoanalytic circles, there has been in debate in the last years, whether in the last sort of, let's say, decades, there has been a change in the way people are kind of dealing with sublimation. Whether there has been a certain sort of, let's say, reinterpretation, or whether we need a reconceptualization, actually, of sublimation as it was presented in the work of Freud and Lacan. Now, in the past, sublimation was perceived something that helps us deal with conflicting feelings. For example, anxiety about death, destruction, and so on. However, as I said before, together with this anxiety, quite often there was a death drive also, which means that we were anxious about something, but we were also, in a way, fantasizing about it. In popular discourse, sublimation was often kind of apprehended mostly positively as something that helps a production of literature, art, and so on. Now, A few years ago, Italian psychoanalyst Rossella Valdre wrote a book called Sublimation, where she questioned, whether actually sublimation today is in a way still possible, or whether there has been kind of a dramatic change, meaning that there has been a kind of a diminishment of the possibility to sublimate. Valdre's idea is that one reason might be that there has been quite an evolution of the psychopathological cases. She says that in her contemporary clinical work, she observes fewer cases of classical neurosis and much more pathologies of the borderline or narcissistic spectrum. Now, capability of the borderline or narcissistic, let's say, spectrum type of patients in sublimating or creating symbols or metaphors might be more compromised. That's her idea, which can have an effect on sublimation. The second reason where she thinks that sublimation might be less possible today is in what she points out, a certain kind of a push for immediate satisfaction and discharge. So we have in today's capitalism even more of a push for, kind of, let's say, enjoyment, and, sort of the pressure to find enjoyment. And, her theory is that, there might be sort of less of a renunciation, less of a sort of kind of, let's say, renunciation, which is linked to possibility of sublimating, because contemporary subject is, in a way, constantly seeking immediate gratification. Valdre concludes that to understand the cultural complexity today and try to entangle, what role sublimation plays today, in a way, psychoanalysis needs to turn to philosophy, to sociology, to economic doctrine, to literature, art, to sort of try to understand what is changing in society. Now, I would say that, yes, we are living in times definitely when we have increase of all kinds of, let's say, pathologies. We can call them borderline or narcissistic, or psychopathological, other types of, let's say, psychopathic signs. But however, I would say that it is not only that there is potentially a change in the nature of sublimation, there have also been opened all kinds of new avenues for jouissance, where actually the subject finds new types of identifications, especially, for example, identifications with cruel masters. And, self-sacrifice in some way plays an important role in these identifications. Now, of course, one wonders what Marx and Freud would say today when, for example, people are, sort of offered to sacrifice the jouissance, or even in the form of sort of like kind of foregoing payment, or in a kind of a perverse way serving the new executioners. A few days ago, I was quite surprised when I read that a job announcement, which was posted by Elon Musk on X, who said that he, who will, together with Vivek Ramaswamy, co-lead the Department of Government Efficiency, are searching for the workers who will be employed at this new department. They're searching, as he writes on X, people with high IQ, people who are willing to work long hours to join this task force to cut costs of the government. He points out that they will be very much hated, these people. He also points out that he and Ramaswamy will personally look at the CVs of the top 1% of applicants, and that these applicants need to be willing to work without pay. Now, this is, I think, where Lacan would probably have, a lot to say, because, the jouissance that, you can get out of serving, the cruel master and, doing the cutting, the slashing, the firing, kind of a castration of the highest level goes beyond anything money can buy. I think potentially you should actually pay, to be able to enjoy, in this slashing and cutting and so on. So I think that, in some way, Lacanian psychoanalysis needs to be brought, I think, kind of to the use of understanding, not only the old ways of kind of keeping the desires unsatisfied, which is very much fueling, capitalism as we know it, but also, I would say, the emergence of all kinds of new types of jouissance. Jouissance is the word which we don't translate in English because the English translation, enjoyment, has a too positive tone. So the French term, is about kind of pleasure in displeasure. So I would say that, in today's times, this kind of, let's say, jouissance, the pleasure in displeasure, also the fantasies about, the end of the world, the end of our lives, and so on, fuel, the political changes in the way I think that kind of will keep psychoanalysis as a kind of fairly profitable profession, I guess, in the future. I guess a lot of people might need some help in our anxiety-ridden times, but I also hope that psychoanalytic thinking will kind of join forces with Marxists and other social theorists and, try to kind of analyze where we are going and sort of, let's say, what might be the next steps for possible social changes.
Thank you. Thank you, Renata, for an amazing and widespread and so many points for us to think about in reading and rereading Marx, right? So many pieces that we now have to try and put together, or not, but at least think about. Mostly, I take it, on this point about the new types of identification, or altered forms of identification, or the different reference and points of desire that you spoke about. New types of identification that completely open up and ambiguate Marx's text on alienation, right? That's what it does. It just kind of it completely kind of explodes the analysis, so that, of course, it's no longer clear what we can think of and do with and expect from the kinds of difficulties, say, that he identifies in the workers' relationship to their work. Because of all of these other identifications possibly with a cruel master, or with other desires, or with other attractions, or with the desire for unsatisfied desire, etc. So, of course, a preliminary question is how to read Marx on alienation, whether to actually try to rehabilitate a psychological reading in a way, or to abandon a psychological reading completely. Now, of course, it's fair that Marx was writing in 1844, and psychology existed as a science at the time, but was very different than psychoanalysis and everything that we've had since. He has a reference to it actually in the manuscripts, where he suggests that actually psychology is unable to do anything right now. It's useless and not a helpful science at all. He has this passage where he says, a psychology for which this, the part of history most contemporary and accessible to sense, right? So alienation remains a closed book, cannot become a genuine, comprehensive, and real science. What indeed are we to think of a science which eerily abstracts from this large part of human labor and which fails to feel its own incompleteness, while such a wealth of human endeavor unfolded before it means nothing more to it than perhaps what can be expressed in one word: need, vulgar need. So one question is, right, so one issue is, how then do we rethink a formulation of alienation? Do we rethink it through instead a theory of action, perhaps, rather than a rich psychological or psychoanalytic framework? So the conditions of misery are what prompt people to act. That is the motor of history, right? It's not so much from a psychological, perhaps, but more from a physical, material reaction to conditions. It then becomes the motor of history, right? Now, of course, if you do that, then that pushes us into other entire domains that also have been opened up by this work, of questions about ideology in a Gramscian way, or questions of regimes of truth in a Foucauldian way, but basically all of the questions about knowledge, belief, sense, knowledge, power, relations of power, that would then relate to whether or not people do act on these feelings of misery in response to the conditions that they are living. Those are other dimensions. It would be important to figure out how they relate, because they do obviously relate to the Lacanian approach and psychoanalytic approach. And of course, ideology is very much something that you think about and write about as well. So it's not as if these are, mutually exclusive in any way, but they feel to me as if they are slightly different paths that then require different interactions between them. So then desire comes back in, and all of the psychoanalytic would come back in through the lens of political beliefs and ideologies, which of course is what you're doing when you're talking about these persons, the death drive, the destructive nature of the death drive, and these desires to tear down the world, right? Because these are ideologies, and they are fed by these questions of desire. Capitalism plays an interesting role here, very interesting in your analysis, because of the way in which it plays on desires and is able to renegotiate spaces. I'm thinking here of Luc Boltanski and Yves Ciapello's book, The New Spirit of Capitalism, and the way in which they show that capitalism is able to adapt to change, to movements for revolutionary change towards creativity and new management styles, etc. And a lot of what you were saying in terms of kind of how capitalism negotiates our desires, feeds our desires and our dissatisfaction, and the important ways in which that works, makes me think a lot of that, which raises questions then about intentionality, right? What exactly, who is it? What do we mean when we say capitalism in that context? Because obviously it's a world that is fed by marketing departments, advertising departments, and other branches of capitalist enterprises that are working on our desires and our desires for unsatisfied desires, etc. But so that raises the question of intentionality and how we might better articulate the term capitalism in this particular context to try and make sense of it. Now, I'm also particularly interested in the way in which these forms of the psychoanalytic analysis of desires here falls into a space that we might call, or how it relates to the irrational, and questions of rationality. It seems as if we're operating at in such a different space than Marx is operating in terms of rationality and irrationality and logic and what one would expect, what one should expect from people, right? It's almost as if these are two worlds, one in which there are logics that should motivate history because of the logic itself, right? And then another space where the unconscious, even though it might be structured in some way, where there are formations of the unconscious for Lacan, still seems to have this feeling as if it's unpredictable billiard balls as to where these desires are going to ultimately take us, leaving us without an ability to decipher a pattern, to predict behavior, to predict behavior in a political way. But it feels, as we enter into this quagmire of the unconscious and the formations of the unconscious, that it becomes increasingly difficult to think strategically, politically about how to act, because of just the unexpected identifications that are going to take place and push us in directions that we might not have anticipated. It seems to, even though it's structured, it seems as if it doesn't leave us with much to hold on to in terms of political action and political prediction. Now, all of it seems entirely right, and in a way, I mean, it's strange to say this, but proven in history or something. I mean, in other words, when one looks at how people relate to their work, right, it's clear that there are other types of identification that are taking place. I mentioned, for instance, this idea of workers feeling a great pride, for instance, maybe in working in an assembly plant that is, America first, right? Or taking an enormous amount of pride in the fact that they are building something that's built in America, right? And that pride then substitutes. It's another identification. It's not. They may actually fully take pride in the object that they are creating, not because it's going to be theirs or because it's going to reflect them, but because it's going to be identified in a particular way, as having an American flag on it or something, right? Now those are going to be important ways that make it impossible, really, to predict the movement of history, I think, and really ambiguates what we could pull out of a theory of alienation. I would say on the end of the world discussion, you know, it's striking to hear about the embrace of this end of the world ideology. But I was actually talking to my adult son about this, and his response was, well, you know, it's kind of like in math when you use the wrong formula, but you get to the right result. Of course, global warming, right, is what is on maybe on the other 75% of the people who didn't respond. He had about 25% of the respondents who were, you know, Christian evangelicals who were thinking it's going to be the end of the world and it's going to happen in Jerusalem, etc. Right? But 75% of those who didn't respond that way were probably thinking, well, no, it's going to happen because of global warming, right? And so I think we would need to also factor that in somehow and try and understand that as well, and figure out how those types of identifications are going to have some tangible results as well. So I suppose the big question then is, it seems as if we've enriched Marx's manuscripts greatly with Lacan and the psychoanalytic framework. The question is whether it allows for the kind of both prediction and understanding that could be useful in a political way, or whether we need to retreat and then push in a different direction on questions of ideology, which, interestingly, of course, are the questions that we address in the next seminar on the German ideology. Yeah, I mean, and those are, of course, tough questions. But maybe you want to kind of address some of that.
The most important question is identification. I think, like, how identification works today, what are the changes? And here it is good to go back to Freud. You know, so Freud's idea about social justice, which he in passing touches in his group psychology, was that, you know, social justice is tied to a certain perception of a group spirit. He even uses the term group spirit. And his idea was that people want to be equal to others. You know, they want to subscribe to this idea of justice. But he said, actually, the idea of social justice relies on the fact that I limit myself so that you will limit yourself too. So I expect that when I limit myself, that there will be a response also of the others, so that we will sort of be kind of equal, which means that we deny ourselves something. He says we deny ourselves, but we are waiting that others deny themselves also something. Now, his idea is that this perception of social justice is kind of coming actually out of envy. He uses, in a strange way, the term envy. Let's say that in kind of, let's say, pre-conscious way, or sometimes, you know, even conscious, but we don't want to deal with it, we might not want to subscribe to some ideas of, let's say, social justice. he gives an example of people who are infected by syphilis. If people are infected by syphilis, they might consciously be telling themselves that they should not infect others. But however, in reality, many of them might feel, why am I infected and others are not? However, the socialization has, let's say, pushed those feelings, the feelings of envy, the aggression, I want to infect others, sort of away from consciousness. So socialization actually, is responsible for people having the thought, I shouldn't infect others. Even if they're, let's say, conscious or unconscious desires, more unconscious or pre-conscious are, why am I infected and others are not? So the question is whether there is a change in today's society where we don't have anymore, those kind of, let's say, repressions at work where, we are trying not to be cruel to others, where, maybe something is unleashed because of social changes, which sort of opens the doors actually to cruelty. Identification with the cruel master is one step in that direction, where again, this identification is not like you have an identification maybe with a kind of a, let's say, father figure. This is an identification with quite a cruel father figure, which is very similar to the Freud's discussion of the father of the primal horde. The father who is the possessor of all women, who is the one who enjoys, and the brothers, are jealous that he is enjoying and are plotting, how to get rid of him. However, nonetheless, this father figure seems to be very present, like the father figures were in, I don't know, Branch Davidian cult, or those, cults where you had, the father figure enjoying and, others being quiet or, in some way are in maybe even, admiring, this kind of a perverse enjoyment of the leader. And of course, what is also important is that one is not identifying necessarily what the words of the leader, whatever the leader is saying, it's not necessary that we want to actually, kind of believe that there is truth. So we live in times where everyone has been now told that everyone can come to his or her own truth. And we also don't expect to believe, let's say, leaders, and leaders don't expect us to believe in them. We have seen that at work in many societies, let's say authoritarian societies in particular, like the leaders like Putin. They don't believe that people believe them, And of course, when you have a disbelief or a kind of a disidentification with the content of the messages, it might be also that you have a kind of a collapse of identifications among people. And that's another important point from Freud, because he points out that identification among people in the group is dependent on the leader loving everyone equally. He takes the example of the army and the church, So if in the army the leader privileges some soldiers at the expense of others, quite often anxiety becomes much more pronounced. He says that anxiety emerges when you don't have that perception of sort of equality and being, let's say, loved by the one who is member of the group and at the same time a little bit outside, also like, the leader in the groups he's analyzing. So I would say that we are losing identification with the content. We are not anymore even kind of believing in authority figures, and I don't think we necessarily need to be sorry for that, It's like patriarchal societies relied on particular patriarchal type of, let's say, authority figures. We don't want that. However, I think that identification has also changed in regard to the question, do we still identify with the big other, let's say? That's a question. Like in Lacanian work, we have two types of identification. One would be an imaginary identification where I identify with someone whom I perceive that might be similar to me. Let's say that if I help refugees, it might be that because I was a victim of war, that I perceive that the other is like a kind of a mirror image of me, or what happened to the other could have happened to me. But more interesting is what Lacan calls symbolic identification, where I identify with certain kind of a point in the social setting, like what he calls the big other, from which I observe myself in the way that I want to see myself as likable. Let's say that one identifies with the idea of helping people, being a humanitarian. And I can give an example from my own, let's say, attempt to teach when my son was small how important it is to help others. So in Slovenia, we have this kind of, I don't know, it's called here big issue or whatever. You know, the homeless are selling the newspapers. You know, the homeless, newspaper. So, you know, I bought the newspapers from the homeless to see my son how important it is to support the homeless. And then there was International Day of Volunteering. And I thought I should volunteer something. What if I write an article for the homeless newspaper? I proposed to them, they accepted. I told my son, you know, I'm volunteering. It's important to volunteer. Now, I wasn't at that moment so much thinking about, you know, helping the homeless. I was thinking about, in a way, the big other, to see myself as a humanitarian, so that I can teach my son, you know, to kind of, let's say, help, a message, like that it's good to be, to help. Now, in some way I failed, because what happened after this, when my lesson sort of, let's say, what was a result of my lesson was that my son continued to buy the newspapers. You know, whenever he had some pocket money, he would buy the newspaper from the homeless. As a present to me, you know, his idea was, my mother is so obsessed with these newspapers of the homeless. This is like a real good gift that I can bring to her, you know. So his idea was he wanted to satisfy my desire, you know. He didn't think about the broader spectrum of, you know, sort of the idea of help. In some way, inadvertently, he did help the homeless because he gave them the pocket money. But, you know, my question is whether this social setting is changing, how we observe ourselves is changing. Do we still want to see ourselves as, you know, believing in human rights, in equality, in ideas of freedom, in sort of helping others and so on, you know, because the symbolic identification is not necessarily feeling the pain of the other, but you want to see yourself as someone who understands the pain of the other.
That's really helpful. And so people should start raising your hands and stuff. And great. Because I mean, so there's a way in which there are two dimensions that I hear, and it's the two dimensions in which a lot of this work has gone. And one is the one that is focused more on desires, and in the story that you were just talking about, and your son's desire to satisfy you rather than maybe learn to volunteer, and in all of the analyses of desire. And then there is the epistemological side of it, which is, you know, what we come to believe, and what we come to believe in terms of our own truths or other people's truths, which, of course, is the whole post-truth debate that we're having, or that we've had. I don't know where it stands anymore, whether this election has annihilated the post-truth debates that we've been having. But those do seem as if they are they have slightly different textures, they have slightly different references, they have slightly different bodies of references in terms of research. They go very well together. They are interlinked necessarily, but they do push in slightly different directions in which one can think more of the Lacanian direction in one side and maybe the Foucauldian or Gramscian or other Frankfurt School directions. Of course, the Frankfurt School, I mean, certain Frankfurters like Marcuse would be particularly at the intersection of the Frodo-Marxism, right? But there does feel to me to be different accentuations, different strengths, one of which leading into the direction of the psychoanalytics of desire, and the other leading into the direction of the epistemologies of belief, in a way. Both of which may be equally important, but having slightly different texture and being different directions that one could push Marx, and that Marx has been pushed, right? And that we'll see Marx himself possibly pushing in that other direction as well. Okay, so let's pass the mic around. Maybe we'll take a round of 3 comments and questions. And so, Oscar, could you pass the mic over here to Daniel Kessler? Thanks for joining us. And is it on? You just got to make sure you got to flip that thing towards the. Yeah, push it up. Yeah?
Yeah, I think that does it.
Perfect.
So,
Thanks.
I haven't heard a lot of discussion about class and psychoanalysis. And there's a very different Freudo-Marxist set of traditions, and that would be that of Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich, Dorothy Dinnerstein, people who look at desire with a sense that desire can be realized, and that desire is shaped by the experience of, what Wilhelm Reich called the sadomasochistic chain that is capitalism, that domination and exploitation are rooted in particular class relations that no doubt have changed since the time that Reich and Lacan and Marcuse wrote. I mean, repressive desublimation is the idea that somehow pleasure and connection is manipulated by capital, which no doubt it is. But I guess I'd like to ask the question that the big other in the US is capital's displacement onto the state and the dangerous other, all the things that people are asked to repress within themselves, and that the violence they experience from capital and the exploitation they experience from capital is redirected toward the state. And so what I guess I'm suggesting is, what in our present moment with the deformation, reformation of class relations, how do we conceptualize a psychoanalytic subject or set of subjects that's rooted in competing reality principles, competing organizations of desire, competing representations of gender? And there's huge anxiety, right, about gender and sexual orientation that the right has seized upon. But the left often calls for rationality as a response to irrationality, including, Freud certainly hoped that the rational could manage the irrational. And yet the Reichian tradition, the Frommian tradition, in very different ways, and we don't have the time to develop that, but that call for desire being rooted in species being, rooted in connectivity to other subjects out of lived experience, which is particular to different class locations, different identities. But there is in both their thought and in some feminist thought an idea of universality of the particular still resulting in some sort of universal connectedness, but not one based on an abstract notion of desire, where desire develops in particular circumstances. And I think that version of Marx can be recuperated by psychoanalysis that doesn't refuse class terms and that doesn't accept Freud's metapsychology, which is profoundly ahistorical, and that early Freud, where the fantasy is not some abstract structural given, but is rooted in particular relationships of power within the family. You know, the abandonment of the seduction hypothesis when we know that incest is all over the place, right? And you know, what did Donald Trump say? I'd like to, if my daughter were not my daughter, I could, do things with her, right? And that's so. Those kind of dynamics, I think, allow us a way of asking, how does power operate in particular subjects in particular ways? How is desire shaped by power relations? And by, there's certainly a lot of gender and sexual anxiety in contemporary America that the right deploys, but the left just asks people to be nice and respectful, but doesn't talk about a kind of desire that's generative and connective and it embraces desire.
Yeah, terrific. And actually, maybe I'll let you address that, because I think that adding more to that. So we'll do one response here, because I think that's important. And it was, there was another direction. I was thinking about writing for the introduction. Didn't do it though. But precisely Deleuze and Guattari, who pick up on the Reichian approach in a certain way, and right, but are very much taken by this idea that no, these are real desires for fascism. It's not a desire for not having a desire, or it's not a mistake or whatever. It's a real willed desire. So. Do you want to address some of that, Renata?
I think that, it was already, let's say, from the 80s on that class has been pushed out from, let's say, discussions or kind of shaped differently. You probably remember Russell Jacoby, Christopher Lasch, and so on, who are already kind of analyzing this kind of a shift from the old type of class related, to proletarian class being different from, let's say, the educated class, or of course the rich bourgeoisie, how it shifts to the cultural differences. You could have a greengrocer, a Korean greengrocer who would earn much more money, but would be, let's say, perceived more lower class than a badly paid college, let's say, adjunct. So they would, although class, if you look from money-wise, the adjunct would be, much poorer, because of the education. It would look as if, he or she is of a higher class, So the whole idea also of creative industries, where basically you have to be proud that you are working almost for nothing because you're doing something creative, also created that kind of, let's say, a veil of ignorance towards the kind of the class differences. And I would say that what we see now is still, the pushing class aside from the discourse. Even Ernesto Laclau was rightly criticized that he was speaking about antagonisms, mostly about, kind of gender, national or racial antagonism, but not, kind of speaking about class as the fundamental, antagonism which marks all other antagonisms in an important way. What we can observe, now, I think, is also a certain kind of a really re-emergence of the question of, who enjoys at the expense of someone else, which is not necessarily directly related to class, but in some way it also is an outlet for, how the class tensions are spoken out. Like what you can observe nowadays is certain kind of, let's say, envy being at work, or jealousy too, in regards to how other people are enjoying. This is like the classical idea of the migrant stealing our enjoyment. It's also very much part of still racist, nationalist ideas. The migrant is often perceived as the one who is enjoying at our expense, is stealing our jouissance, but his or her jouissance is such that, when we say, that their music is loud, their behavior is horrible, they're criminal, or they are rapist, and so on, it's all about the classical ideas of jouissance. They're sort of threatening our jouissance with their behavior. But, often you have also this kind of paradoxical ideas that they are stealing our jobs, and at the same time they are lazy, so both, they are lazy and too active. However, you also have now a kind of a shift where culturally certain, let's say jealousies, at least in some circles, appear to be something you shouldn't have. Like there is much more of an embracement for polyamory. In some circles, it's sort of like something you shouldn't be jealous, if people have potentially multiple partners, because we have overcome previous kind of hurdles of what is also the idea of, let's say, sort of like a family life or love relationship. But then you have a backlash towards this, a backlash with this idea of, let's say, go back to the patriarchal, return to make America great again, not only as a big country, but as a kind of traditional type of living. So we see, I would say, that class is linked in different ways to the perceptions of what is the right enjoyment, who is stealing whose enjoyment, and how do we deal with the problem that actually enjoyment is usually forever inaccessible if we, let's say, subscribe to Lacanian psychoanalysis. But even more problematic for me is the fact that when you have kind of a collapse of traditional values or traditional sort of this fabric of society, which I was speaking about, referring to Freud's idea of social justice, the idea of equality, a kind of a group spirit, you also quite often have a certain kind of an envy emerging towards those who succeed, which is sort of envy linked to the fact that actually, you perceive those who succeed as sort of in some way more cunning, better fraudsters, better at lying, sometimes better at cheating, being more cruel. And so quite often in this envy towards those who succeed, you perceive yourself as not have been doing enough, not only in the old way working enough, but also not being kind of a trickster, or the one who finds a way, to exploit others, which is sort of like a new form, I would say, of self-criticism that you can observe in many authoritarian countries. You feel, the authoritarians will be there forever, and, I'm guilty because I didn't find a way, to better my life. And that self-criticism, I think, very much prevents, sort of kind of some forms of social organizations. Quite often, it is the next step of this ideology, which I analyzed in the work on the tyranny of choice. Everything in your life is a matter of choice. Health, how you look, how your children turn out is a kind of a pacifying way. You stop thinking about social choices. Everything is like an individual choice. And I think that now, with this kind of, let's say, open acceptance that cruelty, obscenity, even in words, aggression leads to success, and that you are beyond punity, as we see now with the United States for whatever you do, is opening up, I think, kind of new avenues of self-criticism, which will prevent even more, I think, thinking about kind of common issue or, organization of, let's say, of society. And of course, which would allow a certain, let's say, articulation of the class divisions.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, right behind there. Yes. And thanks for coming back. Is it on? Is it on? Okay.
Say that from Eric Fromm, in these classic writings or essays about the young Marx and the manuscripts of 1844, makes a beautiful definition of alienation. The shortest, he says, is the loss of the subject in the world of the objects. Harari, in his Nexus, yes, the subject has lost himself in another world, the world of the objects. It's another form of talking of the fetishism of the merchandise. Okay? You are identified with the objects. Harari, in his book Nexus, recommends the use, instead of artificial intelligence, he recommends alien intelligence. Alien intelligence. Probably keeping in mind one of the worst forms of alienation that we have now, which is our loss in the world of technology. So probably most of us, 95 of us, has checked these pieces of technology, these devices, tens of times today. And is now part of our mentality. Harari also comments that we don't talk about computers anymore. We talk about networks, applications, clouds, algorithms. We are now immersed, lost in that new world, the world of technology.
Yeah, well, that brings us to some of our favorite topics, Renata. Algorithms and the digital age.
Yeah, and a kind of structural ignorance where we don't know how they are working, and there is also like kind of no political desire to make them transparent or in any way controlled. So I think that it's quite interesting what you said. Just a few days ago, I was reading an article how difficult it is nowadays for graduates of computer science to get a job. The coders, people who were doing like simple coding, just a few years ago, this was like a step out of poverty, at least to learn coding, maybe in a quick course in community college or something. And nowadays with artificial intelligence, many of those jobs are obsolete because, everyone can kind of use artificial intelligence for simple coding. So now, a lot of people will become, I would say, kind of the unemployable, which will create, definitely a new tension. And of course, we have had still, we still have this idea that the solution for social problems might be more technology. This kind of, let's say, the obsession with technology and of course, pushing the knowledge about society, humanities, and so on, really on the outside. I was just in Chile, and I was surprised how my colleagues there were telling me how, children from early on are pushed into studying STEM, this hard science and so on. And literally, departments of humanities and social science are closing down because it appears, you will be a total failure if you study anything like this, which, however, we work together in Europe. We have quite interesting groups where we work together, actually, social scientists, humanities specialists, with people from AI. So just last year we had a big kind of a meeting in Vienna about the dangers to democracy with the development of AI. And, to our surprise, it was people working in AI who were the most critical of the development, especially pointing out this paradoxical idea that, the companies dealing with AI are kind of self-certifying themselves, like even, the companies which are producing self-driving cars. You don't have any more like kind of a state agency. Now pretty much a company says, I have, tested my product and, believe me, And so we don't have the classical authorities where we would need them. And of course, the United States, unfortunately, is lagging behind, Europe in regards to how to deal with big data, how to deal with the question of collection of big data, how to deal with the secrecy of algorithms, how to deal with the responsibility of companies who are in charge of the social media. Even Europe is, I would say, very slow, but nonetheless is kind of few steps ahead of the United States. And I guess under your new government, the doors are wide open for more ignorance in regards to, what is happening, in the Silicon Valley and, actually what kind of influence this development has on people, on psyche and, on democracy.
Yeah, thanks. David, did you have a question? Yeah. Push the microphone up. Yeah, you got it?
I hope it's on, is it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the two worlds and the gap you were talking of and the diverse modes of identification as well. It might be insightful to take a look to the critical and also the epistemological status of images and feelings. So let's stay with the dream first. Lacan says that the first alienation actually happens with language, but from a point of critical aesthetic, wouldn't it be the image in the vein of John Berger? It's what we see first and what children grasp first and not words. So might our dreams and the unconscious be the first alienation in the thoughts through images and make us realize, well, that we have a desire for unsatisfied desires. And also looking at it through the lens of Marx, isn't it peculiar that the butcher's wife is only dreaming about fish? It's the caviar, it's the salmon, right? There's an alienation almost in a form of a double negation that she cannot have that product she is economically funded on, and also to stay with Rancière, which constitutes also the visual product regime she's living by. So looking now to the feelings, or mostly the feelings that CNI calls ugly feelings, such as envy, would also help to maybe look at the critical part of it. Isn't envy maybe showing especially marginal or minority parts of society what is wrong when I, and Freud was bluntly sexist in that, do have penis envy as a woman? Why isn't that not a form also of criticizing society? Why patriarchy is undermining women's powers? And the same could be said for workers, right? Is the alienation of the product that I've been putting labor on actually the envy that I cannot harvest what comes out of this product?
Thank you. Do you want to address some of the questions of image and feelings?
So, Lacan speaks about sort of the problem with the image in the mirror stage, when he speaks about the mirror stage, when the child kind of observes herself or himself for the first time in the mirror. That's the moment, where, the image of the child and how the child perceives him or herself, are totally, let's say, disjoint. The subject perceives him or herself as much more coherent in the image in the mirror than how the child actually bodily is able to function, and that's kind of the moment where, we already have the moment of language intervening, which is where Lacan says that it is not simply the child observing, let's say, herself, himself in the mirror. It is the primary caregiver who is the important, bearer of language, who says to the child, this is you in the image. So it is before the imaginary, already the symbolic intervenes. You know, the child recognizes herself or himself because someone told her or him that this is the image that you should sort of, let's say, identify with, although the child does not. You know, it cannot put together the body and the image. Now, I really liked your comment about the fish in the beautiful butcher's wife. We can imagine that the fishmonger's wife would have had a dream about the steak, you know, so to keep the desire dissatisfied, you have to dream about something that's not available at home. I guess, you know, she had many steaks and it was more difficult to get fish than the steak in her house. About, you know, envy, now the Lacanian definition of envy is actually that often, you know, envy is not linked to us wanting something. Let's say it might be that I'm envious of someone having a sports car, but it's not that I really like cars so much to be obsessed with it. But my envy is related to the fact that I want to sort of like kind of destroy the enjoyment that someone is getting from the sports car. So I might, you know, my envy is not related to having, my envy is related to another that's not enjoying something. And that's where, you know, envy is perceived as, in a way, more aggressive often than jealousy. In jealousy, I might be afraid that someone might take away something, you know, from me, my lover or whatever. But in envy, you know, I want to kill the enjoyment of someone. However, here, with envy, Russians have an interesting distinction between black envy and white envy. So in Russian culture, black envy would be the destructive one. You know, I want, you know, the neighbor's car to be ruined, while the white envy would be where I would like maybe to sort of work towards what the other has. You know, so it might be perceived more motivating. Masha Gessen nicely described this difference between white envy and black envy in regard to the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014. You know, the idea was that many Russians at that time still had the hope that something what happened in Ukraine when they got rid of the authoritarian leader Yanukovych, that something like this could happen also in Russia. You know, at that time it was still sort of the idea that maybe opposition will have the chance. And so she perceives that as a white envy. You know, when you hope that the social change that is happening in other country might happen with you too. But of course, as we know, unfortunately, it turned into the black envy, you know, kind of with the attack and occupation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, does this work?
It does. Perfect.
Okay. I was just thinking about the implication of jouissance for the Marxist or the communist project, if we understand that to be to strive toward this satisfaction of the desire to come into one's own being, to be in accordance with our species being, like is outlined in the manuscripts, essentially. To do away or to overcome human alienation, then does this not pose sort of a tension there? Is the communist project actually one of a satisfaction of the desire, or how do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Good, yeah. Thanks for bringing us back to...
You want to say something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking about that in the context of Fromm and really what is the relationship to history, right? That we find here, and I mean, it's not clear to me when we go down this path how we can tie it to a theory of history as easily as when we go down other paths. I mean, I think Marx does it very nicely and logically in a very kind of logical and rational way, right? That you know, the alienation is the basis of basically the the overcoming of alienation is, alienation as the motor of history, alienation is the thing that we overcome, the thing that motivates history, etc. But it becomes less clear to me how that can function, whether it can function in the context of the, say, kind of fracturing of these identifications with all the new types of identifications. It becomes hard to imagine being able to tie the theory of alienation to a historical theory, and therefore to tying it to questions of communism and politics. It fractures it in my mind. I mean, it gives good explanations for the difficulties that we find ourselves in today, for sure. Renata, what do you think?
I think it's still very important I think it's still important to think about alternatives, to the existing type of exploitations that are, So I would say the ideas about communism and the ideas which kind of think about the ideas of equality to kind of, let's say, the change in the organization of society are important. If we call them communism or somehow else, might not be so important, but it is like an alternative which we need to think through, especially in regards to the damages that we are imposing on ourselves and, the climate too. But, from psychoanalytic point of view, I'm of course more pessimistic. I'm not so optimistic as Marx is. And here, I'm reminded of the discussion between Freud and Einstein, when they were exchanging sort of letters about peace, where, Einstein was, kind of propagating the idea of peace and hoping that the next generations will fully embrace them. And, Freud was much less optimistic, feeling that we need to take into account the fact that people nonetheless have, certain kind of push towards self-damaging behavior, aggression, not only towards others, but also towards themselves. So I would say that psychoanalytic notions also about the desire, being unsatisfied, the problems of jouissance and so on, need to be definitely taken into account and, kind of bring another layer to the utopian, discussions that Marx engages in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing that it does, I think, is allow for an analysis within different political economic regimes as well. So in other words, I think that it allows for a rich analysis of what might have been going on within socialist countries, in persons, workers' relationship to their product as well, right? So that becomes useful and helpful to think about, I don't know, we were talking about the solidarity movement in Poland last time, right? I think that this material becomes really helpful to think through a movement like Solidarity in the 1970s in Poland as well.
Or self-management, ideology, which, kind of was how Yugoslavia was organized. The idea was that the workers are the owners of the means of production, not the party, not the state. And of course, it created quite a complicated bureaucratic system of delegates and so on. But nonetheless, there were lots of kind of positive elements. in it, which with the collapse of socialism were completely forgotten. Some elements remained, the universal health care, free education, let's say in Slovenia also the abortion, which is paid by the state. The right to abortion is written it's written in the constitution, and basically those ideas were very quickly pushed aside with the collapse of socialism, where what happened was in certain kind of let's say the lack of thinking about possible alternatives to the type of, let's say, kind of the capitalism that existed in other countries. So basically it was kind of a takeover by the ideology of capitalism, privatization, and so on, which unfortunately, in the case of Yugoslavia, was propagated as you need to first, take the property into the hands of the state. The self-management regime abolished, in the fight against the kind of the Stalinist organization of society was then propagated by some, Western advisors as the necessary step to privatization. And of course, privatization also meant pretty much kind of a co-option of all the means of production by the big corporations. There's an interesting book which questions whether the countries in the Eastern Europe only imitated, the West, by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes. The title of the book is Where the Light Gets In, and they're questioning, why this imitation, why not thinking about alternatives. And of course, their idea is that there was an imitation of a regime while there was not maybe the structure of kind of democratic institutions at work. But my idea is that capitalism thrives on the idea of imitation. Let's say, fake it until you make it. That's kind of, let's say, the logic, at least of the neoliberal ideology. So I don't think we were kind of simply imitating. There was, I would say, a certain kind of a logic of capitalism, which in some way just co-opted more of the spaces, more of the means of productions. You see that in Germany very clearly now, the East German part, which unfortunately now a lot of people identify with Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right, still felt like as if they were sort of like very much exploited when the West, sort of like merged with them. But it was not kind of mergers of the equals, was, the dominant part kind of taking over the weaker part.
There we are. All right, perfect. Then thank you for the discussion. And then I was wondering, who is we have like many nasty father, like negative father, and then who is nowadays the good father? Because it's very interesting. Because in Italy there are Massimo Recalcati has written, like a Lacanian psychanalyst, has written like a book that is Telemaco Complex. There was the society without father, analyzing like the microphysical level of many people, many youngs going to the psychanalyst in search of father, something that lead. And in this, I was also remembering the reading of Benazayang, Les Passions Tristes, les souffrances psychiques, les crises sociales. It was analyzing that many people go to the psychanalysis and then they search like for collective solutions that the psychanalysis cannot give directly. And in this, in this, it is super connected to a reflection that we had now in Italy, because they have created like a film on Berlinguer, one of the last leader of the Italian Communist Party, that they was like at the same time like a leader of the Communist Party, and then like this figure of good father inside this space. And I was thinking that we have not like the left, we have like the people that are they're against, trying to avoid the crisis, try to avoid the fascism and so on, but not like these kinds of left that was inspiring people vote because they believe in another world possible, then who is today like the good father, the people that lead positively in our society and not only like the negative trying to resist the fascism that advancing. This is like, yeah.
You have
So hold on for a second.
a modern figure in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, the father
Has been replaced by a group. I don't think that we should be so nostalgic for kind of the necessarily the father figure. But the question, of course, is whether you need still a person with whom you identify. That was already Freud's question, whether, an idea is enough to identify people, or an idea needs to be embodied, that there is a person who embodies the idea, and then you identify more easily. And I think in some way it is true that quite often the ideas need to be embodied. There needs to be, not necessarily one person, but some people who are, in some way leaders, and who are in a way uniting people. They can be very democratic leaders. They don't need to be, the kind of the cruel father figure which we have discussed too. And I think that nowadays it's very difficult for those kind of leaders, especially the political sphere, to emerge because of the cruelty of the discourse, the social media really going after, whoever. In majority of societies, nowadays you see that people just don't want to risk their peace to sort of, be candidates for something. Only extremely rich people with incredibly narcissistic kind of egos often, are, and those who are like a Teflon person, nothing sticks to them, psychopathic personalities are often the ones who present themselves as political leaders, which is why you see, a new form of, let's say, alienation emerging, about which political theorists are talking about. Not necessarily only apathy of people who don't want to follow politics anymore and are enclosing themselves in private life, but alienation from any political sort of party. A lot of people don't go to vote because no one represents their ideas, and that's kind of the the alienation in the political sphere that is very important to understand. Not people are not apathetic; they just don't have anyone to identify with or vote for. Unfortunately, here the populist leaders are thriving because they appear to be the ones who are saying the truth. I was shocked reading today the British news that Nigel Farage is thriving now in Wales and in impoverished parts where industrial let's say production stopped decades ago, or mining stopped, and so on, and it's still very poor part of Britain. And Nigel Farage, is the one who is, as they say, shaking things up. The traditional parties are, kind of for status quo, but he seems to be telling, how things are, and that's unfortunately exactly what happened here, or what happened also in Argentina, and will happen also in many other countries. Where we have to know that now 3/4 of the countries around the world are authoritarian or authoritarian leaning. So democracy is really, on the way, sort of out of being kind of the dominant or desirable way of organizing society. We have to know that now 3/4 of the countries around the world are.
Good. Thank you. All right. So, we were talking about alienation in the objects of the digital world. And, so I think that what this is telling us, the breakdown of the digital world, is that we need to go across the street to the bar, to the pub, and have a drink and continue the conversation in a different setting, without, unfortunately, without everybody on Zoom. Yeah, I think that we should end with that, which was and have a drink, which raises a lot of questions about alienation and figures who are problematic. Let me just say then, first of all, thank you very much, Renata. I want to thank everybody else as well, Ricardo, for all your work, and Reno and our AV team, Luis Bello and John. Okay, so we're going to be convening at Arts and Crafts in the pub downstairs. There will be drinks and food and a good conversation. But also, I want to tell you that we will be meeting again on December 9th. So that's actually a Monday, December 9th. Put in your calendar. We will have the philosopher Jules Joanne Gleason come. Jules Gleason is the editor of the book Transgender Marxism that just came out, co-editor of Transgender Marxism. We're going to be focusing on Marxist German ideology and Monique Wittig's The Category of Sex. And so I hope you'll join us on Monday, December 9th at 6 p.m. right here for that, which will be Marx 513. Okay? All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.